All right, good morning and welcome to Web3 Wednesdays, where we chat through some of the complex and nuanced topics in Web3 and crypto at large so that you can stay ahead of the curve. So today I am joined by Philip Collins. He's an associate over at Konvoy Ventures, which is a prominent gaming fund that focuses on infrastructure, technologies, and platforms that drive the frontier of gaming. So Konvoy recently launched a $150 million fund to back a target of 30 gaming firms over the next 2.5 years, which includes Web3 gaming entities. Phil's position on that team gives him a bird's eye view of the direction that early stage gaming ventures are starting to turn in the space, and we are keen to get his take on where Web3 gaming evolves from here. So Philip, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate you having me.
All right, well, jumping right into it here, can you explain a little bit about your role at Konvoy and some of your own Web3 gaming work?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm part of the investment team here as an associate on the investment team, as you mentioned, which for me really means working on everything from sourcing, evaluating opportunities, and going through with the execution of the investments that we make. We're an investment team of 6 in total, so it's kind of an all hands on deck type of structure where everyone's pretty intimately involved with everything that we're working on at any given time. As a fund, we're particularly focused on infrastructure and tech within gaming, so that applies to both Web3 and traditional games. Within Web3 in particular, we actually got involved kind of early last year through Sky Mavis. That was our first investment into the Web3 ecosystem. So I'd had a pretty front row seat into everything that's gone on since the rise of Axie Infinity. Web3 is interesting for us because as an infrastructure and tech fund, the route that we took ended up looking a lot more content heavy than what we typically do. And so we've done investments in things like Cypher and Genopets and a couple other unannounced studios. I think the way we looked at Web3 last year was having blockchain in a game was almost an infrastructure layer in and of itself. And so we got pretty heavily involved there. I think as the content portfolio became a little more saturated of content teams going towards Web3, we've ultimately shifted a little back towards the infrastructure focus that we've always had. So that's kind of how we worked with Web3 in the past, and definitely excited about the future, but also I think cautiously optimistic in the near term.
I think that's fair across the board. And I also like that framing of the past versus the future, because that ties in very well into the theme that I really want to, kind of tackle here, which is, this idea of we've seen the first wave now of Web3 gaming and how that plays out so far. How do you see what originally classified that first wave of Web3 gaming? What were kind of the key characteristics and takeaways that we all saw in that first iteration of the industry?
Yeah, I mean, at the foundational level, it was really all about the notion of ownership and the ability to have your time and contribution within a game ecosystem rewarded. And I think that Sky Mavis was actually a great example of this, because the rise of Axie Infinity is really what brought this to the forefront of public attention. Axie Infinity was not the first blockchain game around, and it wasn't the first time somebody had worked on one of these, but it was the first instance of it becoming a popular phenomenon or a worldwide phenomenon. And so I think that the notion of ownership was really the core part of the beginning. And so Web3 gaming really did begin in the context of financial outcomes, right? I think, we talk about it all the time, where everyone seems very financially oriented in blockchain games, and that's been one of its downfalls up to this point. And I think a big reason for that is the first wave of games was heavily focused on the earning component versus having some kind of deep core loop. I mean, we're investors in Axie, but it's not the most complex or the deepest video game in the world. It had a great trading card game loop that a lot of people really enjoyed, but a big appeal was also the ability to monetize the skill that you had in that world. And so I think that's really what characterized the first wave to me.
Yeah, and I think that's totally fair. The financialization of users' time and assets, et cetera, it's a unique theme that I think is likely to stick around for quite some time here. And as we move into, I think what arguably could be called the second wave of Web3 gaming here, some of those trends that caught on really, really early in the early Web3 gaming days may or may not continue to stick around. Right? We've seen a couple substantial industry shifts around what people think is sustainable, around what people think is fun. Where are you seeing some of those core characteristics that kind of speak to the foundation of what could be the next wave of Web3 gaming?
Yeah, I think the next wave of Web3 gaming will look a lot like the current wave of traditional gaming in many ways. And I know it's a little bit of a cheap answer because everyone's kind of just constantly talking about how games need to be more fun in Web3. And I know that sounds like such an interesting retort for what's been happening, but at the end of the day, it's true, right? If you want to appeal to the 3 billion gamers in the world, you have to make games that they want to play. And so that's part of shifting away from just the financialization of games and moving towards having thriving in-game economies and asset libraries that people want to buy, not just because they think they can flip them for a quick buck, but because there are games that people want to engage with on a daily, weekly basis. And so I think that at its core on the content side, it's about building content that people want to play. And again, as simplistic as that sounds, we don't have to reinvent the wheel of what makes a fun game. And we see so many great games teams moving into the Web3 space. And I think the most promising thing about that is they know how to capture audience's attention and make things that are perceived as fun, whatever that is to a given gamer or a given member of that gaming audience. I also think the next wave of Web3 will be characterized just by easier use of these games. And as an infrastructure and tech fund, that's constantly what we're thinking about is how do you make it not just more interesting to the user, but also more feasible, where there's not as much friction to get on and play a game for the first time. I think we've seen that with Sky Mavis, where you had to really want to play that game, put in time and effort to make sure that your funds got into the Ronin network and into the Axie Infinity ecosystem more broadly. So I think we've continued to see more and more infrastructure flow into this space, but whether it is a game studio itself or an infrastructure provider, building the bridge for traditional gamers and just making it more of a seamless approach of playing a game, I think will be a big part of that next wave. I think we'll continue to see more community-driven development, which is something that's always been a big part of the Web3 ethos, if you want to call it that, where the community is not just a passive consumer of the game, but an active participant in how it should be built and how it should be managed throughout its live ops phase. I think all of these are core parts. Maybe one of my hotter takes on the next wave of gaming is we may see less usage of what we've seen in the past of volatile tokens, where you have prices that are constantly fluctuating for a game's currency. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more stable currencies or hard currencies implemented, just so that users are constantly aware of what the value of a token is. And I think you can still do ownership and you can still do everything that Web3 really has to offer without necessarily having the volatile token. Obviously, the reason for it is having a fixed supply, and having that fixed supply really makes people feel like equity owners. But I think there's still a lot you can do around ownership without that in a way that's a little bit less intimidating to the non-blockchain natives that you're targeting as a game developer.
Philip, I love that across the board. And I honestly could not agree more with every single one of those points. And I think, off the top there, some that obviously stand out, some of the more evident ones, right, is a return to actual gameplay, right? Number one. Number two, an easier user onboarding experience, right? Really making sure that the UX here is smooth. And number three, this idea around making blockchain, maybe not just about the financialization of the assets, but maybe just a return to some form of you own what you do in the game. And it's the user's choice where that goes from there, right? And maybe it's not this direct comparison to an equity entity, right, where you own parts of the game and you can financialize that. Maybe it's just, you can trade your assets inside the game now. You can interact with other third-party marketplaces. So I agree. There's a ton of different ways that I think that the space is going to go here in a little bit. And I think that we're starting to really see the early roots of that. Are there any really, speaking broadly, I don't want to make you call out any games here in particular, but are there any game genres, in particular that you think are that really lend themselves well to these new themes, as we kind of walk into the second phase of Web3 gaming here?
Yeah, it's interesting because the first phase of Web3 gaming was characterized by a lot of what I would call copycats in a lot of ways, where there were a few different genres that people tended to centralize themselves around. And so for a while, that was trading card games following Axie. That was RPGs, things like horse racing games. And I think that first wave was a lot of games where blockchain and, transacting in-game assets and owning in-game assets, and also wagering and whatnot fits seamlessly into the way the games were structured. So with trading cards, makes sense. You own them, you trade them, you have a different deck as you evolve and as the metagame evolves. Same thing with RPGs with complex item systems. Same thing with horse racing with wagering. And so we saw a lot of kind of I don't want to call them simplistic games, but just a lot of repeats. To be completely honest. as we go into the next phase, I mean, I think it's funny because technically you can apply blockchain to just about any genre that has cosmetics, and so you can try to implement on-chain economies into just about any of those games. So whether it be a first-person shooter, an RPG, RTS, MOBA, there's elements of blockchain that can be infused into those. I do think I'm particularly excited about the implementation of Web3 and NFTs into game structures that have some kind of like meta game around them. And I think this is something you and I have talked about in the past, Sam, where adding value to your NFT in ways that aren't necessarily directly involved in the gameplay loop, where, you know, having a social or political element to the game ecosystem is a really cool way to infuse value into these assets in a way that is very non-traditional, and is a really cool way to log the historic action of a character and item, and understanding what has put value into that in the past. So yeah, I think it's pretty open-ended, and I think that the possibilities truly are endless in some ways at the surface level of tradability. But, you know, getting deeper, I think it's not even necessarily a genre thing. It's more of a gameplay style that we'll continue to see play out.
Though, Philip, I love that. Yeah, and the cosmetic point that you started with is also just so spot on, right? I mean, CS:GO skins market's legendary, right? And you take exactly that same concept and you map it into your Fortnite skins, your League of Legends skins, etc. Totally non-gameplay, you know, impacting in any capacity. You don't pay to win unless you consider, you know, certain skins to be busted because they blend in with the textures better. That's about the only way you can get away with it. And that really does, you know, lend itself very well to your second point, right? Which is it may not necessarily be about genres as much as how we can, you know, basically enable this second layer, this metagame on top of the original game itself without impacting core gameplay. And obviously gamers are very sensitive to things like pay to win, right? Like that's obviously a major concern. And so anytime you introduce trade or financialization of assets, you're going to have claims of pay to win. And so, yeah, these are items that I think are going to be very, very interesting. And I think you're going to end up with a lot of multi-layered games, you know, frankly, stuff like Cult of the Lamb, for example, where you have two different game types that are molded into one. And maybe one half is, you know, personal and fungible and you get to trade and you can have your own assets, et cetera. And then the rest is like a core esports type game loop. Those types of things I think are going to see some substantial play here over the next 12 to 18 month period.
Yep, definitely.
And then I, you know, kind of digging in tangentially to that, right? So games are one component of the gaming industry. Obviously, the gaming industry is larger than just content pieces. There's infrastructure, there's platforms, there's socializing. There's a lot of different components that need to come together here. So as we kind of look forward into where we estimate Web3 gaming is going to be in the next 12 months, are there any core pillars, you know, of gaming at large that you think are still missing, or that, you know, may become even more critical than they already are, that you would pay attention to as we migrate into a more Web3 friendly gaming environment?
Yeah, I think that there's so much infrastructure being thrown at the problem right now, right? We've seen countless wallets, marketplaces, analytics tools, all these foundational pillars that are designed to make it easy for traditional game devs to make Web3 enabled games. I think that, you know, we've hit a little bit of a wall of innovation in that space. I think everyone is kind of has the same foundational goal of make it easy to play these games, make it easy to engage with these games. But at the end of the day, I think the infrastructure is going to need to be informed by the content that comes to the market. This is a concept that Union Square Ventures talked about a couple of years ago in the myth of the infrastructure phase. We're building infrastructure that is too separated from its content, kind of leads you to create slightly misguided or misaligned infrastructure projects. And so I think we're starting to see a little bit of that in Web3 gaming, where infrastructure that's been developed has really been guided by the shortcomings of existing content. And that existing pool of content is actually relatively small. I think most of the games that we talk about on a day-to-day basis are still in development, right? The number of live games with real audiences is pretty tiny out there right now. And so I think that we're gonna continue to need to see the infrastructure players adapt to that. And that doesn't mean that they're not solving a core problem today, but they're solving the current problem that is faced by a small number of users. And I think it's really about keeping eyes open and adapting to the content over time, and making wallets and onboarding tools and marketplaces and analytics suites that are really informed by the games themselves. And so I think there's a lot of infrastructure building in isolation right now, and that'll have to evolve over time. But the core suite is being built. It's just how far can it actually go? I think that's maybe a concern that I have in that world today.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And what we've seen, even from a venture perspective, is that it seems like a lot of the early content plays have actually just started to pivot into being infrastructure plays for one reason or another. They just from a business and financial standpoint, they gave up on their content and want to sell infrastructure. And so I do think that there's the risk of, exactly like you said, like there's a lot of infra that's building in isolation, frankly, for a very, very small set of users. And we do still need to see exactly how, the actual games that consumers ultimately end up adopting, what issues they run into and what the infra needs to be actually building towards before, a lot of folks keep, kind of building in the dark and shooting in the dark here.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason that things like Discord have spun out of, initially ambitious game projects, which is, you find new problems that you want to solve, and
that's right,
they end up being more ubiquitous than a single piece of content can be. And I just think we'll see a lot more of that in the Web3 gaming space. But I'm trying to be patient on the venture side and acknowledging that this first wave of infrastructure is not an be all end all that'll solve all problems moving forward. And there's going to be a lot to learn over the next couple of years as a lot of exciting content starts to come out of the Web3 world.
Yeah, fair enough. So this next one here I've got for you, this is obviously always a tricky one, right? So regulatory pressure. Okay, this is always fun. And particularly, with the recent implosion of FTX, which was completely unregulated in any capacity, and we saw all kinds of, nonsense there. Gaming is its own type of, special snowflake even. Arguably, it sits slightly outside the jurisdiction of most ordinary regulators. But obviously, even in the past, we've seen, problems with virtual currencies and, who is a money transmitter and who isn't in some of these gaming gray markets. So when you move into a Web3 capacity where you have these digital bearer assets that carry real value, where do you see the regulatory pressure coming from? Do you think that's going to be an issue for the space?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's inevitable, right? And it's coming, and things like FTX's collapse accelerate that. It opens up regulators' eyes and says, okay, there's a real problem here. I think the issue with things like FTX or BlockFi and some of these other centralized assets that have come crumbling down is the problem isn't necessarily a technical one, right? It's a human one, and in terms of making bad decisions in the form of poor risk management and honestly just being too aggressive, because in the last year being aggressive was correlated with success because everything was just going up and to the right and you were rewarded for being overly aggressive and just kind of hoping that the cards kept stacking and didn't fall on you. And as we're starting to see them fall, there's definitely a trust impediment that's coming out of this, and the people that were already hesitant about Web3 are even more hesitant and less willing to make the jump because it feels like a very unsafe place to play. And so I think that, it definitely slows things down. I don't view it as an existential issue for blockchain and blockchain gaming more particularly. But I do think it just slows down the adoption from people that were already hesitant. This is one of those areas where I think gaming is actually a great use case for people to eventually come on, where as great content comes on board and games are built that people want to play, people will be willing to give it a shot. But we really just need use cases that are sufficiently compelling for people to say, okay, I know I have a little bit of a weird feeling about this, but this looks like something I should try. And I think that'll get people on board. It'll slow it down. I think undoubtedly it's a hurdle.
Yeah, agreed. And is there, anything to date, either from your own personal standpoint or even from Konvoy's, just in general, that has got you really excited? Is there anything, that folks should be paying attention to that you think people aren't paying enough attention to right now?
It's an interesting question because there's already so much happening in Web3, and honestly, people are paying attention to seemingly everything across Web3. As an infrastructure investor, I would say just the underlying pillars that are making Web3 gaming more accessible, I do think is really exciting, despite the fact that it's going to have to adapt to the content eventually. I think that the notion of making Web3 abstracted into the background, anything that does that is really what gets me excited. I think the more you can isolate Web3 and blockchain elements and take it out of the user's purview, I think is a great thing. Like there's so much we don't know as gaming consumers about what's happening under the hood of our favorite games from a networking perspective. How is the code actually being run? How are we actually being match made against other players? All of this stuff is things that we don't have to care about. When I buy a skin through Riot or Activision, I don't care that I'm using Coda or PayPal or whatever their backend system is. It just doesn't matter to me. I just want the skin because I play the game. And so I think that's still what I'm most excited about. And I don't think that's something that isn't getting enough attention. I just think there's Web3 is already under a microscope, and so there's very few things that are really like bubbling under the surface that are being neglected. I think once we get past wave 1 and 2 and get into wave 3, there will be more room for creativity. But we're just not at a very creative phase outside of the content elements of blockchain gaming right now.
No, I agree with that too. And I like the ode to wave 3, which we aren't even near yet, which I'm very excited to see myself. Yeah. I can't wait to see all this stuff completely move onto chain. But I agree, right? Like no, when you open up your Chrome browser, right? Like you don't consider what an HTTPS request is, or you don't go contact your TCP/IP. Like none of this is important anymore, right? And so it will be abstracted. Blockchain will continue to evolve, and the UX will keep getting better. Philip, this has been a ton of fun. One last question here for you. As an active participant yourself across Web3 venture and building, you've seen a ton of things both succeed and fail. To those people right now who are trying to set out and build things for themselves, do you have any advice for them? Things they should look out for, things they should certainly do?
Yeah, I think on the content side, what I'd say, and it might be a little counterintuitive, is really just like don't rush. I think we've seen a lot of rushed projects over the last year. Everyone's just trying to get their name into the mix, and it makes sense, right? Having adoption cases are important. It's important to have content out there that people can be onboarded to in Web3, but don't do this at the expense of depth of your game. Obviously, if you're a hyper casual game, this doesn't apply. But I think for a lot of the larger scale games that we see, people are just trying to pump things out. And I think that there is merit in building iteratively and building in public, but don't just try to build a half-baked game because you want to be the first game out there. Just try to build the content that you want to build, regardless of what's happening in the Web3 craziness. I think on the infrastructure side, it goes back to our prior conversation around just keeping your eyes wide open around the content that is coming out and making sure that you're staying up to date on the needs of actual game builders. If you're building tooling and you're not building a game, odds are there are problems happening that you're not even aware of. And I think creativity on the infrastructure side will continue to be driven by games. And you can only go so far today, but I think the next wave of winners on that side will be very responsive to the needs of the content that's being built. So don't settle on just being a simple adoption case. Keep thinking about what are the next problems that game devs are going to need, and listen to them when they tell you that. I think those are probably the two big high level things for each side of the house for now.
I love it. Build iteratively, build in public, and really, really try to think about what people need tomorrow. Stay close to the games and stay close to the builders. Philip, this has been awesome. Thanks a ton for coming on. An absolute pleasure. We hope to see you guys around again.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Appreciate you having me on.